Every morning, Daniel Carter walked past buildings like this one, buildings he could never afford to enter. Today, everything was in a lobby built for billionaires. Daniel looked like he didn't belong. No one there knew the truth waiting inside that envelope.
You don't belong in this building! Leave immediately!
In seconds, she stripped away his dignity. Soon, she would call him Sir.
Mr. Daniel Carter!
Daniel Carter had exactly $14 in his wallet the morning his life changed forever. And if you stay until the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why that number mattered so much. But before we get there, hit that like button and subscribe. Because stories like this one, stories about ordinary people who are underestimated until the moment the truth comes out, are exactly what this channel is built on. For 11 years, Daniel had been raising his daughter Emma alone in a small 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Chicago. His wife, Rachel, had passed away when Emma was only 3, leaving behind a grief that never fully faded, only softened into something Daniel carried quietly beneath his tired eyes. He worked as a maintenance technician for an apartment complex downtown, fixing leaking pipes and flickering lights for tenants who rarely looked at him twice. He wasn't bitter about it. He simply believed that showing up every day, working with his hands and coming home to make dinner for his daughter was enough of a life. He had never wanted more than that. He had never expected more than that either. Emma was 12 now, sharp-witted and endlessly curious, the kind of child who noticed everything, including the way her father's shoulders sagged a little more each year under the weight of bills he never spoke about out loud. She knew money was tight. She knew her father skipped meals sometimes so she wouldn't have to. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that her mother's family, a name Rachel had almost never mentioned, had once been part of something enormous. Rachel's estranged uncle, a reclusive tech investor named Arthur Whitfield, had built a private holding company decades earlier that eventually merged with a logistics and manufacturing conglomerate now valued at nearly $20 billion. Arthur had no children of his own, and after a falling out with the rest of his family many years before Rachel's death, he had quietly kept track of only one relative he still respected. Rachel, the niece who had once written him a kind letter when no one else in the family would speak to him. When Arthur passed away peacefully at the age of 81, his lawyers spent months searching for next of kin, only to discover that Rachel herself had died years earlier, leaving behind a husband and a daughter neither Arthur nor his legal team had ever met. The inheritance was rerouted, as the law required, to Rachel's closest surviving descendant, Emma, with Daniel appointed as trustee and, due to the size and complexity of the estate, temporary controlling shareholder of Whitfield Industries until Emma came of age. It took the legal team nearly a year to untangle the trust structure, verify the family line, and finalize the paperwork. During all of that time, Daniel had no idea any of it was happening. He was simply living his life, going to work, dropping Emma off at school, and trying to keep the lights on. The morning everything changed began like any other. Daniel had just returned from an overnight shift, exhausted, when he found a certified letter waiting in his mailbox from a law firm he had never heard of. He assumed it was a mistake, or worse, some kind of scam, the kind of letter that promised riches in exchange for a small upfront fee. He almost threw it away, but something about the letterhead, the formal seal, the mention of his late wife's name printed clearly on the first line, made him open it. The letter requested his presence at the headquarters of Whitfield Industries that same morning for what it called a time-sensitive matter regarding an inheritance and trusteeship. Daniel read it 3 times before he believed it was real. He didn't have a suit. He didn't have time to prepare. He simply grabbed the letter, put on the cleanest hoodie he owned, and took 2 buses downtown, arriving at a glass skyscraper so tall he had to tilt his head back just to see where it ended. He had walked past that building 100 times without ever imagining he would one day walk into it. Now, standing on the sidewalk with the letter clutched in his hand, he felt smaller than he had in years. The lobby, when he finally stepped inside, was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Marble floors stretched out in every direction, polished so perfectly they mirrored the towering ceiling above. Well-dressed professionals moved briskly in every direction, none of them sparing him a glance, except for the ones who did, and those glances were not kind. Daniel approached the reception desk and explained, as calmly as he could, that he had received a letter asking him to come in. The receptionist, unsure what to do with a man who didn't match any executive she recognized and who had no appointment listed in the system under a name she could find, asked him to wait while she made a call. It was in that moment that Victoria Hale crossed the lobby. Victoria was the Senior Vice President of Corporate Operations, A woman who had spent 9 relentless years climbing every rung of the company's ladder, sacrificing weekends, relationships, and sleep to get exactly where she was. She was brilliant, disciplined, and utterly convinced that the only thing separating successful people from unsuccessful ones was effort. She had little patience for anyone who didn't carry themselves the way she believed success should look. When she saw Daniel standing near the reception desk in a faded hoodie and worn sneakers, clutching a folded piece of paper like it was a treasure map, something in her simply snapped with irritation. She didn't ask questions. She didn't wonder why a man might be standing quietly, patiently, waiting to be helped. She simply decided in the space of a few seconds that he did not belong, and she said so, loudly enough for half the lobby to hear. She told him this was a private corporate building, not a shelter, and that he needed to leave immediately before she called security. Daniel tried to explain about the letter, but Victoria cut him off, telling him she didn't care what piece of paper he was holding, that people tried these kinds of scams all the time, and that if he didn't walk out on his own, he would be removed. The lobby had gone quiet. Employees paused near the elevators. Visitors near the front desk turned to watch. Daniel felt every set of eyes on him, felt the old, familiar shame of being looked at like he was less than human simply because of what he was wearing, simply because he didn't fit the picture of who belonged in a place like this. For a moment, he almost turned around and walked out. It would have been easier. It was what he had done his whole life, shrinking himself to avoid conflict, absorbing disrespect quietly because fighting back had never gotten him anywhere. But then he thought of Emma, waiting for him at school, waiting for him to come home and tell her everything was going to be okay, the way he always did, even when he wasn't sure it was true. He thought of Rachel and the quiet dignity she had always carried, even when life had been unfair to her too. So instead of leaving, Daniel stood a little straighter and simply said that he would wait for whoever the letter told him to meet, and that Victoria was welcome to call security if she felt she needed to. It was in that exact moment that the elevator doors at the far end of the lobby opened, and 2 men in dark tailored suits stepped out. One of them, an older gentleman carrying a leather portfolio, scanned the lobby for a few seconds before his eyes landed on Daniel. He walked forward immediately, extended his hand, and greeted him by name, addressing him with a level of formal respect that made the entire lobby fall into stunned silence. He introduced himself as Gerald Whitmore, lead counsel for the Whitfield Family Trust, and he apologized profusely for the confusion, explaining that Mr. Carter had been expected upstairs nearly 20 minutes ago for the finalization of the transfer of controlling shares in Whitfield Industries. Gerald continued, his voice carrying easily across the marble floor, that as of that morning's signing, Daniel Carter, acting as trustee for his daughter Emma, now held majority ownership of the company, a nearly $20 billion enterprise, and would be assuming oversight of all executive operations effective immediately. Victoria's face drained of color. The coffee cup in her hand trembled slightly as the weight of what she had just done settled over her. She had spent the last several minutes humiliating, in front of an entire lobby of employees and visitors, the very man who now controlled her paycheck, her position, and quite possibly her entire career. She opened her mouth to speak, to apologize, to explain, but no words came out. Daniel simply looked at her, not with anger, but with the quiet, tired patience of a man who had been underestimated his entire life and had finally, unexpectedly, been given the chance to be seen. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gloat. He simply turned to Gerald and asked to be shown upstairs, said he had a lot to learn and that he intended to take his new responsibilities seriously. As he walked toward the elevators, the lobby remained frozen in stunned silence, the sound of his sneakers against the marble the only noise in the enormous room. Over the following weeks, Daniel immersed himself in a world he had never imagined belonging to. He spent long nights reading through financial reports, operational structures, and personnel files, determined not simply to hold the title of owner but to understand what he now had responsibility for. What he discovered troubled him deeply. Several senior executives, Victoria included, had spent years prioritizing short-term profits over the well-being of the company's employees, quietly cutting corners on safety standards at manufacturing plants, delaying wage increases promised to warehouse workers, and funneling excessive bonuses to upper management while frontline employees struggled to make ends meet. Daniel recognized that struggle immediately. He had lived it himself for over a decade. Instead of making dramatic, sweeping changes overnight, he chose to move deliberately, meeting personally with plant managers, warehouse supervisors, and floor workers, asking questions no executive had bothered to ask them in years. He restored the wage increases that had been quietly shelved. He invested in safety improvements that had been ignored for cost-cutting reasons. He restructured executive bonuses to be tied directly to employee satisfaction and safety records rather than short-term stock performance alone. Victoria, to her credit, did not resign, though many expected her to. Instead, she requested a meeting with Daniel directly, walked into his office, and offered a full, unguarded apology, not just for the lobby incident, but for the culture of dismissiveness she had helped build within the company for years. She admitted that she had judged him based on nothing but his appearance, and that the shame of that moment had forced her to confront patterns in herself she hadn't wanted to see. Daniel, who had never been the type to hold on to anger, told her that everyone deserved the chance to grow, and that if she was serious about changing how she treated people, he would be glad to have her help rebuilding the company the right way. Over time, she became one of his most trusted allies in the transformation, this time leading with humility instead of contempt. Daniel never moved into some sprawling mansion, never let the money change the man his daughter had grown up admiring. He still made Emma breakfast every morning before school, though now there was more on the table than there used to be. He still wore his old gray hoodie on weekends, though people at the office had stopped staring at it and started respecting the man wearing it. Emma, watching her father navigate a world that had once dismissed him completely, learned a lesson far more valuable than anything money could buy. That dignity was never about what you wore or what you owned, but about how you carried yourself when the world tried to convince you that you didn't matter. Months later, standing once again in that same marble lobby, this time greeted warmly by name from every employee who passed, Daniel paused for a moment near the exact spot where Victoria had once told him he didn't belong. He thought about how easily that morning could have broken him, how easily he could have simply walked away and never known the truth. But he hadn't walked away. He had stood his ground quietly without anger, simply refusing to disappear, and in the end that quiet refusal had changed not only his life, but the lives of thousands of employees who now worked under a company finally being run with the same decency Daniel Carter had carried with him his entire life, long before anyone in that lobby ever knew his name.